Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
The month of June so far, exactly how we like it. No storms of consequence, no A name in the alphabet just yet, and perhaps part of the reason why Saharan dust, our good friend. We're going to talk about exactly why the tropics are so pleasantly quiet on today's edition of Tracking the Tropics. Welcome into the Stream Center, folks. JB here with you with our panel of meteorologists here on this edition of Tracking the Tropics. Of course, being joined by meteorologist Rebecca Barry here on the Max Fender 8 Weather Team. Joining us on the Max Fender 8 Weather Team, our latest addition to the team, meteorologist Juliana Mahia, who we're going to be hearing from as well. And our featured meteorologist today, joining us from our Next Star sister station, WBTW News 13, Hannah Ronner is joining us, meteorologist over there. We'll be hearing from her. Rebecca, man, this is what we like to see in June. Things right now really quiet out there.
Absolutely. And so there is no greater feeling as a meteorologist that forecasts for the tropics to wake up every day and see no development not expected over the next 7 days. And so that's the official word from the National Hurricane Center. Of course, we're always stalking the different long-term forecast models, and even the GFS doesn't have a storm 10 days out. So that's how you know it's quiet, because the GFS loves to throw up a GFS-icane 10 days out, and everyone freaks out and posts all about it on the internet. But if even the GFS can't spin up a storm, that's when you know it's quiet. And we do have that healthy plume of Saharan dust across the Atlantic right now, swirling into the Gulf. And so we love Saharan dust because it is typically associated with very quiet times. The Saharan dust itself does not cause the storms to be quiet, to not form, but all of the conditions that allow for the Saharan dust to make it all the way across the Atlantic like this are also storm squashing elements. And so it's more of a relationship, not a causation. And so we just love Saharan dust, though, because we get those more vibrant sunsets. It does typically signal a temporary pause in tropical formation. We do get less conducive to Saharan dust and more conducive to storm conditions as we make our way throughout the summer. So we enjoy this typically from the beginning of summer. And of course, we're always just enjoying those hazy sunrises and sunsets, especially here in the Tampa Bay area. We love our sunsets, but there's a little bit more to it. It is iron rich, and so that does help with coral reefs. It helps feed the coral reef when it settles down into the ocean, but it can affect algal blooms. And so we're very concerned about red tide here in the Bay Area. And so this can unfortunately impact and help out red tide, acting as a nutrient source for it. And then the most unfortunate thing about it is people with respiratory sensitivities can be bothered by Saharan dust. And so it is typically, for especially Floridians and people in the United States, it's not thick enough to bother most people. You know, you see some images across parts of Egypt and parts of Italy when the Saharan dust goes different ways, and it's so much closer, it's much thicker. We don't experience that, and that's the good news, is that we generally look for the lighter conditions, and generally we're just looking for the quieter conditions in the tropics. We're looking for the hazier sunrises and sunsets, and it's just a signal. It's a mental signal to us that, hey, everything's quiet and it's okay out there.
Exactly. And, I feel like I've gotten a little tickle in my throat from some of the dust. I know you've definitely been seeing the vibrant sunsets. We've gotten a lot of photos in our email to WFLA weather from recent sunrises and sunsets. It is gorgeous, but then the hazier kind of milky look to the sky lingers a little bit. Right now, luckily, we've kind of kept most of the thicker plumes away, kind of just getting like little trickles of some Saharan dust rolling in. But otherwise, another part of this too is dirty rain. That the Saharan dust kind of resides in that 5,000 to upwards of about 15,000 feet up in the air. So it's sitting right where our showers and storms then grow to, and the rain quite literally brings it all down to us. And so when we do see those thicker plumes, we're driving around with our kind of orangish brown covered cars. And then also what we can see, dry air aloft, and can make our summer storms more powerful. And that's when we can get kind of more problematic storms in a local sense with the connection to the Saharan dust. And then really what we feel most is the heat drying up our forecast. If it does then have enough of an influence, kind of days like today where we're tracking drier air in the atmosphere, not necessarily completely tied to the Saharan dust in today's case, but very much then leaving us bone dry, and then we get to heat up more. So today we're tracking mid 90s across the area here in the Bay Area. But yeah, so there's a lot of pros and cons when it comes to Saharan dust. Otherwise, there's also a few other elements. We're kind of slow to the roll. Typically by about June 20th, we see our first named storm, and we're not shaping up right now to be doing that at this point. We're not expecting any tropical developments for at least the next 7 days. So what we're, going to be monitoring throughout the season, and right now the projection is to stay an ENSO neutral, which kind of has a deceptive tone to it, because that doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to be neutral in the tropics. There is a reason why NOAA and CSU are expecting an above average season, and that you can kind of see the layout here. So with El Nino, which is what the ENSO phase we typically like to see for the Atlantic hurricane season, helps to keep wind shear high across the Atlantic basin, which then limits tropical activity. When we see neutral phases, it can actually be fairly aggressive, and we see upwards of about 3 times the amount of storms here, where you see neutral at about 45 hurricane landfalls that we've seen since 1950, and then La Nina upwards of 50. So it's kind of almost neck and neck with how the season plays out, neutral versus La Nina. La Nina, the least ideal of either scenario, of either of the 3 scenarios. But either way, as of right now, it's looking like, according to the Climate Prediction Center, through about the winter time, we're probably going to ride out with an ENSO neutral. But what we're also monitoring, and a big part of the aggressive forecast, is warmer than average sea surface temperatures. So right now, part of the reason, not only is the Saharan dust, part of the reason why things are quiet, we've been tracking some tropical waves propagating across the Atlantic and the main development region, but they're not kicking into gear yet because there's 1, Saharan dust, and 2, the Atlantic still needs to warm up a little bit. Yes, we are still warmer than average, but typically you see on that legend there in the middle, when we get to the mid and upper 80s, low 90s for sea surface temperatures is when there's actually a better chance for tropical development and storms to really kick into gear. So we're kind of lacking that, at least in the main development region. You can see very, very steep sea surface temperatures south of that in the Atlantic. But now as we flip over to the Pacific, some questions, or at least what I've been kind of curious about, has been how active the Pacific has been in comparison to the beginning now of the Atlantic hurricane season. And now that's not incredibly unusual. Actually, the Eastern Pacific and the Pacific's hurricane season begins May 15th, hence why we start getting tropical outlooks for the National Hurricane Center on May 15th, leading into the beginning of our season on June 1st, our season in the Atlantic basin. And so we're on now the 5th named storm in the Eastern Pacific. And again, technically their season does start earlier than ours. A big part of this too are these very intense currents of ocean currents in the Eastern Pacific. And so you see those very, very deep reds, borderline kind of almost purples there. It is plenty warm for storms to be generated in these areas. However, it has been pretty impressive with how the Pacific has taken off so far throughout the beginning of their season. So I do want to turn it over to Hannah to kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on. But we have, with the Atlantic being so quiet, it is kind of our time that we can go back and look at kind of like historical data and just kind of see what's going on in the Pacific, because they are on their 5th named storm. Yes, their hurricane season has been going on for a month at this point. But for the Pacific, June 20th, we're on June 17th. Their first named storm is already happening ahead of schedule. And again, now we are on 5. I came to work this morning because I'm a morning meteorologist. I came in at 2:30 and it was just a tropical depression when it was just an area of interest yesterday. So it's already gotten its act together a little bit faster. Now, again, we're looking at Tropical Storm Erick making it 5. Their first hurricane isn't until August 11th, typically speaking, or rather like even earlier parts of July. But that one, Erick, is forecast to be their first hurricane of their season, and it's actually going to be their first one to make landfall too. 5 is definitely pretty fast. Thankfully, most of them have been very weak. They're 40, 45 mile per hour tropical storms. They're kind of hardly anything to talk about. But Erick is the first one that's giving a little bit of life. It's expected to be a category 2 with the last update that I saw. Winds of 100 miles per hour coming to shore in southern parts of Mexico. Of course, bringing the wind, the storm surge, and the rain, upwards of a foot of rain for them as well. So this is going to be the first one that's providing a little bit of oomph, and it is highly unusual. I tried to get as much data in before the show as I could. So the first one that I went back to was 2018. They also, that season, had 5 named storms in the month of June. The 5 were for the whole month, though. Again, we're only halfway through, so we're definitely ahead of schedule in terms of the Pacific. The 2018 season did have 2 category 4s, though, in the month of June, so perhaps that season was a little bit more of an intense start compared to that. And then beyond that, you have to go back to the 90s, 1992, 1990, and then well into the 80s. But this is still the fastest that we've accumulated 5. All of those years have had 5 named storms in the month of June, but this is definitely the fastest that we have seen so far. And again, at least most of them were weak, but this one is definitely coming to life a little bit faster, and it is going to be packing a punch for Mexico. And also the landfall is happening pretty soon. You know, we're only 48 to 60 hours out from landfall, so that's not a ton of time to prepare. When we're watching waves off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic, the time frame is like 7 to 10 days. That is a long time to be watching systems and seeing how they progress. So for this one to still be a tropical storm, but also expected to be a Cat 2 within the next 2 days is something that Mexico needs to be watching very closely.
It's a combination of the formation zone being so close to the coast and also those warm sea surface temperatures. It seems like this is definitely going to undergo some rapid intensification.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, because I know people at home are thinking, okay, if I'm on the East Coast, if I'm over in Hannah's Market, or if I'm in Florida somewhere watching this, is the Pacific activity that we have seen so far, I mean, already being up to Erick, obviously 5 letters into the alphabet, is it consequential at all for the Atlantic hurricane season? Is it a precursor, or is it tied to the Atlantic activity in any way?
No, I definitely wouldn't say. We have had weird like crossover storms before. We've seen some go from being a named storm in the Atlantic, crossing over like the small little section of Central America, and then doing stuff in the Pacific. But for the Pacific to cross to the Atlantic, that's something that would be highly unusual to happen. I don't even think that would really be possible because they have eastward movement. They're moving away from the continental U.S. Hawaii, that'd be something to watch out for. But for us here on the East Coast, we wouldn't need to be worried about storms in the Pacific even remotely coming near us.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Hannah, because we have a question coming up a little bit later on in the show about that specifically. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about sea surface temperatures, Juliana brought up the map here right on cue. Warmer sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, could that be tied to the Atlantic? I mean, is there any just sort of ingredients that have a correlation between if there's activity in the Pacific, there's activity in the Atlantic, or are they completely separate from a scientific perspective?
Well, the overarching themes, the fact that it is warmer, it would be happening in the Atlantic and Pacific, so they could both be. But the most you could connect them is that INSO neutral. That's the global pattern that we're all in. And so that would be the most that I could connect them in my mind is that, we have the calmer winds across the Atlantic in there into the Pacific. And so that leads to less shear. And so they would be experiencing similar conditions there. That's the only real way I could connect level of activity in Pacific to Atlantic. What about you?
I think that's a good point. Where my brain goes is like equatorial warming, and just that it could be a signal for the potency of warming and the level of warming. But when it comes to quite literally the oceanic bodies, there's not necessarily a connection between the two. They very much exist separately.
So Grandpa Joe, Grandma Jane, if you guys are seeing all the activity and all the storms popping up in the Pacific, don't worry. What our meteorologists are saying is there isn't really an exact correlation between storms,
exactly.
Popping up more later on this season in our section of course, the world. Folks, what we're going to do now is we're going to bring in your questions. Speaking of Grandpa Joe and Grandma Jane, I'm sure they're out there. We're going to ask your questions to our panel of meteorologists using our hashtag system. You see them all around the screen. You can see hashtag Hey Rebecca, Hey Juliana, Hey Hannah, Hey JB. If you use any of those hashtags in social media and in the social media comment section, we can bring up your comments just like this. So the first featured comment that we have from social media, it's a hashtag Hey Rebecca question from Luke. And it reads as follows: which areas of Florida will be most impacted by hurricanes this year? You know, it's funny because on the previous episode of Tracking the Tropics, we were giving such praise to, you know, how forecasting has come so far in the last decade.
Yes.
But it hasn't come so far that you can say, hey, look, in July, August, September, these sections of Florida have to watch out.
If I could make that forecast, I would be a zillionaire.
There you go.
Exactly.
But the best that we could do now is that spaghetti plots now look like cooked spaghetti. When I started, it looked like now spaghetti plots look like uncooked spaghetti. When I started, it looked like cooked spaghetti. Models were like this all over the place. You really had no clue where these systems were headed. And so the forecasting has come so far over the past 20 years, and it's continuing to improve. I'm hoping next week to get on an expert to talk about the Google AI forecast model that's just come out. Well, it's been here, but it's had a big splashy press release. And so people are paying more attention now.
Yes.
And so forecasting will only get better with technology, but it's just not to the point that we can say, oh, it's an East Coast year or it's a West Coast year for the hurricane season. We can't tell you by months which formation zones are more likely right now. If we were to see some formation, it is the West Coast that would most likely see the development. It is closer to land this month, that sort of a thing. But as we get closer to September and late August and September, when we start to see those tropical waves rocking and rolling off the coast of Africa and making their way closer to us, that's when we have the better chances for the East Coast. So Juliana just pulled up the June formation zones, likely and more likely zones. So that's why we always worry about it. Well, it's generally a tropical storm if it forms this close to us and heads on shore. And so sometimes we call it the drought buster if our rainy season hasn't quite started up just yet, and we get one of those weak tropical storms pushing across the state. It's actually pretty beneficial. And so we like those. But we don't have a drought problem this year. We've already got our rainy season rocking and rolling.
Exactly. What, an inch and a half, 2 inches just yesterday, overnight? Yes.
Yep.
But yeah, this does a good job of kind of visualizing the reason why areas along the West Coast, but this is just the month of June. This fluctuates moving forward throughout the season because of different patterns, things like the Bermuda high that fluctuates and can steer storms differently. When the Saharan dust eases up, then we get development sooner, earlier on, quite literally and physically in the Atlantic basin, farther to the east, and then these storms track towards the Caribbean, and then that all changes when the upper levels then kick into gear, and that's when we're in monitor mode to determine whether or not this is going to be, it's looking forward when we're watching storms, essentially. So also a good point, what we were talking about before, is where we're at in season, and where this is specific for the Atlantic hurricane season. So I know Hannah was mentioning how typically the Pacific, I think, sees their first hurricane by July, where we don't see our first hurricane until August 11th for the Atlantic. And we're usually seeing our first named storm by now. Our first major is usually rolling around by September 1st in the Atlantic. So it's just kind of that waiting game at this point for something to brew up. It's you don't want to let your guard down because we're just waiting and it's quiet out there for now. Very much the forecast still calling for an aggressive season moving forward. And here's a look at the names.
Yeah, no Andrea yet. Thank goodness, right? So we're 5 into the alphabet in the Pacific, but we haven't even touched the alphabet or even sniffed the alphabet so far this season in the Atlantic.
Yeah, there's nothing in as far out as we can look to suggest that this quiet pattern would break over the next couple of weeks. So I'm kind of expecting it to stay this quiet, which means our Tracking the Tropics episodes are going to get so nerdy when it's quiet. We dig deep.
Right, yeah. Speaking of nerdy, let's get to this question because I referenced it earlier and it's coming your way, Hannah. Linda wants to know, what are the chances of these Pacific storms crossing over Mexico into the Gulf and then forming there? We always get this question when there's a lot of activity in the Pacific and virtually no activity in the Atlantic.
Yeah, so typically when we're like watching tropical waves off the coast of Africa, they all have that like westward movement. So we have seen storms cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that's not saying a category 5 from the Atlantic is crossing and maintaining category 5 status. What you usually see is like the remnants of some tropical system. So it like breaks down enough to where it's just a cluster of thunderstorms in the Caribbean, crosses over Central America, and then does something else in the Pacific. I think we had that in 2022. So it wasn't that long ago, but it's always usually very early in the season. It's your A named storm crossing over and doing something, and it does get renamed when it's in the Pacific, but it has happened before. So for the Atlantic to the Pacific, that is way more likely to happen than from something going from the Pacific to the Atlantic. If we did see something like that, it would be like more of a north movement. And it would, again, just be a cluster of thunderstorms. It would not be maintaining any form of hurricane status, because anytime it moves over land, circulation is disrupted. It breaks down a lot. So I would be more worried about the Pacific getting something from us versus vice versa.
Hannah, I remember that storm that you were talking about because it is so rare. We didn't know if it was going to get named, if it was going to keep the same name. And so we ended up calling the National Hurricane Center. They ended up making a statement that if the low had if it maintained its low pressure system, the center of circulation as it crossed land, it was going to keep the same name. But if it basically fell apart enough that they couldn't find that closed circulation, then it would get a new name when it reformed. And so I would remember it being so rare that like we didn't know what the rules were. It was wild times.
Only a couple of times I think it had happened. So something that's a little crazy to think about there, that you can even have the crossover storms. But again, they do tend to be a little bit weaker. And it's also important to note that, especially with you guys being in Florida and having Debbie, Milton, and Helene last year, I feel like June 1st happened and we were like, okay, like, where is it? Where is it coming from? So it is perfectly normal to be off to a slow start like this. And at this time last year, Alberto was just a little area of low pressure. So we didn't even really have a named storm at this time last year, but we also got Beryl a little bit later, and that happened way ahead of schedule, with Beryl breaking all kinds of records. So it's nice to be quiet right now. And again, like Rebecca said, doesn't seem like this pattern is going to be breaking up in the coming weeks. Good news.
You hang out on this show long enough, folks, we get really nerdy. So that's just a little taste of some of the comments. But I like this one here from David, hashtag Hey Rebecca. Does Saharan dust make it hard for airlines flying like through Saharan dust? Does it impact air traffic? I mean, we know it obviously has a dramatic effect in a good way on sunsets and makes for beautiful sunsets, but air traffic, I'm not so sure.
And so if it were thick enough, it could. So it wouldn't happen in the United States, but areas like Italy, countries that are closer to the Saharan desert, they get much, much thicker dust. And so it can be thick enough there to close airports and that sort of thing. But for actual pilots, they fly through clouds and they fly through rain. So they oftentimes fly through the lower visibility systems. And so if you're a pilot, you actually get rated for that. It's called instrument rating flying. And so you have to have that special designation that you know how to fly a plane just based on looking at the instruments, not looking at visual cues, because the visibility is down so far. And so it could be thicker, but they could also change altitude. What was your altitude, Juliana?
Typically, from my understanding, it gets lofted upwards of 10,000 feet, and maybe a little higher than that.
Yeah.
But I think for the most part, I imagine what cruising is 30,000.
Yeah, so it would be momentary, that they would be flying through that. They would get above it pretty quickly.
Exactly.
If you looked out your plane window, would you be able to see any impacts from Saharan dust, let's say, at that particular altitude? No, right? Because we're talking about particles of
it would have
dust.
to be really thick. It would have to be right over along the coastline of Africa. Like you can see on satellite pictures, you can see kind of a discoloration. It looks almost similar to the graphic Juliana has up, like the satellite pictures that they take of Earth when they can see the Saharan dust plumes. But when you're in it would just maybe look a little hazy.
Right.
Unless you were really close to the desert and the dust was much, much thicker than what we experience once it makes its way across the Atlantic.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, because we're always thinking about Saharan dust when you're looking at it from the ground. And of course, the sunset pictures that we get are so dramatic and beautiful. But yeah, looking at it from 30,000 feet up is something I never really thought about before. We always get new questions on this program, which is great. Thank you to our audience for asking questions with our hashtag system here on Tracking the Tropics. Before we wrap up, Hannah, it was great to have you as our featured meteorologist today. You and the News 13 team over there. What are you going to be keeping an eye out for with this particular hurricane season? We always end our shows with our featured meteorologists asking that question. Is there something that you guys, from a theme standpoint, are paying close attention to this year in the Atlantic?
So usually when we are monitoring for any tropical systems, especially one that has South Carolina as a whole in the cone, we almost always are getting burned with excessive rainfall, whether it's even just from a tropical storm or a hurricane. We have had horrible flooding in our parts of, northeastern South Carolina from Matthew in 2016, setting record river levels across our viewing area. And then for Hurricane Florence to beat Matthew's records less than 2 years later. We were pretty lucky last year. The rainiest that we got was from Debbie, which of course hit Florida before it made its way into South Carolina. So anytime that we're going to be worried about even the smallest tropical system, it's going to be excessive rainfall and how that impacts our rivers. We were in a drought since Hurricane Helene, and we have already fixed that in just the matter of about 4 weeks. We've had more than 7.5 inches of rain so far this month.
Wow.
So we're not going to be going into hurricane season in a drought. We have a abundance of rainfall, which means it's not even going to take that much rain. It won't take a soaker of a system to lead to huge impacts in our viewing area. So fingers crossed, we don't have to worry about any flash flooding and river flooding.
Well, for all your viewers there in South Carolina, we hope you guys are in for a safe hurricane season, a uneventful hurricane season. We thank you for joining us today, Hannah, and a shout out to Juliana, her first episode of Tracking the Tropics. We'll be seeing a whole lot more of Juliana. You were talking, Juliana, about how you have seen this show previously in your career, and now you happen to be on it. It's great to have you as part of the team.
Yes, I'm thrilled to be here, especially after watching it now for several seasons. I'm kind of geeking out a little bit that I get to be a part of the team.
Yeah, we can't wait to hear more from Juliana. Of course, the entire Max Fender 8 weather team here as part of WFLA and as part of Next Star Nation, with great meteorologists joining us on the program, just like Hannah joining us from WBTW. That's going to do it for this Tuesday edition of Tracking the Tropics. Of course, we are right there in the palm of your hand on the streaming app on your smart TV as well. Tuesdays, 12:30 Eastern. 11:30 Central. We also have additional episodes, of course, when storms form. So for Hannah, Juliana, and Rebecca, I'm JB. Folks, we'll see you next time on Tracking the Tropics. Have a good one, folks.
Find Tracking the Tropics on these platforms. And for storm updates, the latest models, and helpful resources, visit trackingthetropics.tv.